So all of this begs the question of why people mobilize with such passion and such great risk for democracy. Why do people stand in very long lines, in sweltering heat or in difficult conditions, and make the sacrifices that they make in order to participate in the simple act of voting for a government? What is it about democracy that motivates people to demand it, to risk for it, to sacrifice their time for it, to become active citizens in the operation of a democratic system? Well, we know that democracy is the best system in the world for defending human rights. We know that empirically we can establish quite easily that civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, due process of law, freedom from torture, all of these things are much better protected under democracies than under any non-democratic form of government. And indeed, you can go to the website of Freedom House, look at their report, Freedom in the World, for any given year. And Freedom House rates political rights and civil liberties each on a 7-point scale, as we will shortly see, with 1 being the most free and 7 being the most repressive. Now we can look at the ratings for countries on political rights, so for example, to contest in free and fair elections for power, elections that are held between multiple political parties, and in essence see how democratic countries are. And we can see what's the correlation between that and protection for civil liberties. There's not a single country in the world, not one, that has a good score on civil liberties. Certainly not a 1 or a 2 on the 7-point scale, not even a 3. So there's no country that's below the midpoint on the 7-point scale that is better than average on civil liberties that's not a democracy. Democracies can be illiberal and fail to do a good job of really respecting and entrenching human rights and civil freedom for their citizens. But no dictatorship can do a good job of defending civil liberties, for the simple reason that if people have freedom to speak, freedom to organize, freedom to assemble, freedom to publish, freedom to blog in the internet and the new social media, they will use the voice that they have as free citizens to demand political accountability, to demand popular sovereignty, to ask why they can't organize an opposition party and have free and fair elections to determine who rules. In the day and age we live in now, it is almost impossible for a regime to grant freedom in the civil sphere and not face irresistible demands to grant it in the political sphere as well. And of course, we have countless incidents of people who demanded freedom in their country very eloquently and passionately in ways that were mobilizing their fellow citizens and who had to be locked up by the regime that wasn't ready to grant these political rights to their citizens. Aung San Suu Kyi spent something like 20 years under house arrest. 15 of the 21 years from the 20th of July, 1989, until her release on 13 November 2010, Aung San Suu Kyi spent under house arrest, confined to her own home, because she was such a threat to the military regime in Burma that they feared if she was a free person, she would mobilize the country again to demand democracy. Look at Liu Xiaobo, the recipient of the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize in China, who was arrested and imprisoned in December of 2008 for the simple act of writing and promoting a charter, a vision for China of democracy known as Charter 08 that takes off on the Czechoslovak Declaration of Human Rights, Charter 77. Look at the Egyptian blogger Khaled Said, who simply was expressing concern about corruption in the police on the internet as one lone individual without even a massive political agenda, but whose exercise of freedom of speech in this simple way was met with a terrible, brutal fate. And of course, it was the suppression of freedom in Egypt and the particular atrocity of the beating to death of Khaled Said that helped to motivate the mass movement for democratic change in Egypt and the formation of a very famous movement on the internet in the social media sphere called We Are All Khaled Said, the Facebook page that helped to change Egypt. Here we see an Egyptian protester carrying a giant picture of the ousted president Hosni Mubarak in Tahrir Square in February of 2012, in which they were demanding political accountability for Mubarak's suppression of the movement for democracy. People care about having voice. People care about being able to express their opinions, expose wrongdoing, choose their leaders, mobilize for their political beliefs, values, aspirations, and principles without having to live in fear of victimization or suppression or arrest and torture simply because they were exercising their democratic rights of citizenship. And when people are able, for the first time, to cast a vote to determine who will rule their country, it is an act that has deep and intense meaning for them, and it is the sort of thing that can mobilize them to take great risks and to endure great hardships, including standing in the hot sun for many hours in order to have this simple satisfaction of being able to cast a vote to choose who will rule their country. Here we see the mother of the martyred symbol of the pro-democracy movement in Egypt, Khaled Said, a woman named Layla Marzouk. And she is the mother of the young man who died once he was picked up in an internet cafe for blogging about police corruption and distributing a photograph on the internet of it, and supposedly being taken in for questioning, but you saw the result of the questioning. Here we see the look of hope and redemption on her face as she shows her ink-stained finger walking out of a polling station after having voted in the first meaningful election of her life, the Egyptian presidential election of May 2012. So this matters to people, that they can hold their rulers accountable and thereby achieve popular sovereignty and some measure of a rule of law and political accountability. People don't want to live under the arbitrary power of dictators who are above the law and who cannot be constrained or really disciplined by their society. There's a long trail of experience across the world of dictators who have enthralled and dominated their country and really captured the predominant share of wealth of their country and abused the human rights of their country and lost the confidence of their countrymen and women because of their massive corruption and abuse of power. This includes the Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos, who built this massive mountainside monument to himself, which ultimately was bombed in 2002 and fell into disrepair because people didn't even want the symbols of his dictatorship being visible any longer. It includes the fallen dictator in Libya, who was overthrown in a popular uprising in 2011, Muammar Gaddafi, the late Venezuelan strongman Hugo Chavez, who moved a great portion of the Venezuelan population to support him in his campaign for a social, what he called Bolivarian revolution, to remake Venezuelan society, but who profoundly violated property rights, human rights, the rule of law, and deeply polarized his country in the process of pursuing these goals by authoritarian means. And the sad, tragic case of the Zimbabwean dictator Robert Mugabe, who inherited a rich, thriving, pluralistic country with the end of white minority rule in 1979, and then his election to the presidency in 1980 at the helm of a new non-racial government that was supposed to give rise to a multi-party and tolerant democracy. Instead, Mugabe launched a ruthless campaign of victimization upon his rivals, particularly in the African political opposition in Zimbabwe, in Matabele land, and killed an estimated tens of thousands of fellow Zimbabweans in a reign of terror to try and suppress this ethnically based political minority and compel them, as he did, to merge into his party, ZANU-PF. And Zimbabwe then began a long downward slide toward arbitrary rule, kleptocratic corruption, and economic failure and international and regional isolation. So democracy is important in part because it not only protects human rights and gives the people the ability to replace bad, abusive, corrupt leaders through the simple vehicle of regular, competitive, free and fair elections, but it also generates a rule of law in which you have the multiple elements of a rule of law all working to reinforce one another. So you have individual rights protected through the guarantee that no one can be charged and held guilty for crimes committed without a due process of law that involves clear established procedures and a fair and neutral impartial hearing by those procedures to determine guilt or innocence, that involves transparency in the functioning of government and in the functioning of the legal system, predictability in terms of having laws that are known in advance and that can guide behavior and that are enforced in a way that is uniform across different constituencies, geographically, socially, and so on. Stability in the overall legal and political climate, and enforceability and accountability in terms of having the laws apply to everybody and not just the poor or the powerless. And ultimately even being able, as I said in the first lecture, to hold accountable the most powerful office holder of the land. In a democracy, the Constitution is supreme. Here we see a picture of the United States Supreme Court depicting, in a way, the highest authority in the United States, the one beyond which there is no final appeal, is not the legislature, it's not the president. It is the Constitutional Court of the United States, which is the Supreme Court, which is the ultimate arbiter or interpreter of the ultimate law of the land, which is the Constitution of the country. Democracies do a better job of protecting property rights, ensuring that people cannot have their land seized without fair compensation. They do a better job of protecting the environment because in a democracy, you can't have the wanton destruction of the environment and the popular mobilization against that without people being heard and having a chance to use the courts, use the parliament, use the streets, use the mass media to force the issue onto the agenda. In an authoritarian regime, this can be done in secret. In an authoritarian regime, the looting of the natural environment and the destruction of its physical sustainability can happen without recourse to the courts, without any means for those who are wronged or those who believe in the principle of environmental sustainability, without any means for them to protest or use different institutional mechanisms to express their interests. And we know that whenever things can happen persistently in secret, without public debate, and without recourse to the courts, much greater wrongs can be committed. So the ability in a democracy to freely mobilize public opinion and use the different institutional arenas of the law and the representation of public interests to put boundaries around what development can do in relation to the environment is a very important advantage that democracies have. We have, of course, the theory of the democratic peace, that in a democracy, there's not only a greater likelihood ultimately of domestic peace, certainly an organic peace among groups who have come to accept the legitimacy of the overarching political system. But in particular, we know from statistical evidence that there is a peace that prevails among democracies. And it is the case not only in theory but in fact that no two democracies that are clearly democracies, that clearly meet the test I have articulated, have ever gone to war with one another. And of course, the more liberal are the democracies, the more that is true. Because democracies affirm principles of nonviolence, and democracies put in place popular mechanisms of decision-making and accountability that are very difficult to override in the costly and often traumatic decision to go to war. So that the public requirement for dialogue and the constitutional imperative of leaders to be held accountable periodically to the public through elections creates strong brakes on the impulse to just use force to try and resolve a dispute. Democracies share values that make them more likely to dialogue and compromise to settle their differences. And democracies share, as I've suggested, political processes that raise the bar on the decision to use force. Now, this may not work in conflicts between democracies and other forms of government. We certainly have no shortage of circumstances of democracies coming into violent interstate conflict with non-democratic regimes. But it is very striking to note the power of the democratic peace thesis with respect to interstate interactions among democracies. And it does suggest that a world of democracies would be a much more peaceful and internationally lawful world.